Good afternoon, everybody. This is Robert Perkins, the immigration professor. And this afternoon, we're going to talk a little bit about the most common method that someone can immigrate based on sponsorship by an employer. And it's called labor certification. Sometimes it's also called PERM, P-E-R-M, for the online methodology that was adapted for the process in 2005. You can see all my videos on my website at www.immigration-professor.com. Additionally, we have offices in Illinois as well as in California, and you can give us a call at 310-384-0200. The process of sponsorship of a prospective immigrant in most cases involves a labor certification. There are some cases where it doesn't, and we'll get into that in other videos. Again, it's a three-step process. The first step is with the Department of Labor. I think I've run out of markers, so what I'm going to do is change markers and hope that the next one works better. There we go. Okay, so the first step is with Department of Labor to obtain an approval, which is called a labor certification. A labor certification is a document where the Department of Labor, in essence, finds that the employer has conducted what's called a test of the labor market. And we'll get into a little bit more detail as to how that test is done, and that there's a shortage of people that are minimally qualified for a certain job, and that the only person the employer was able to find that could do the job was the prospective immigrant. And again, we'll get into a little more detail as to how that's done, but that's step one in the process of immigrating or getting a green card through this process. The second step is called the I-140, and this is filed with immigration itself, now called the USCIS. And in that process, the employer has to make certain showings and reveal their finances and so forth. And again, we'll get into more detail later as to what that involves. And the third part of the process is called the I-485. That's assuming it's done within the U.S. It could also be done outside the U.S., and it's called consular green card. What we're going to do for purposes of this video is just assume that the employer and employee are doing this within the United States. And we'll talk about that. So it's a three-step process. One thing that I think it's important to emphasize is that this process takes a long time. The amount of time that it takes depends upon where the immigrant is from, because there's certain amounts of green cards available for certain countries. And it also depends upon which job category the person is in. If they're in a category that requires higher degrees, it tends to be faster. And I'm oversimplifying here, but for purposes of this video, I think that that's okay. So let's get into what the process actually involves. Step one, showing that the only person the employer can find as the immigrant is the hardest part of the process. First part of what it requires is that the employer lay out what are the minimum qualifications for the job. And there's only so far that the employer can go. They can certainly say, for example, for an IT person, they can require certain programming languages. They can require certain skills related to IT, but they can't go so far as to require that the IT person, be also talented in singing or something unrelated. And there's a lot of rules for that. So the first step is to define the qualifications. The second step, once you've done that, is to advertise. The employer is required to put the job in two Sunday ads in a paper of general circulation. For example, in Los Angeles, it would be the Los Angeles Times would be one. In Chicago would be the Chicago Sun-Times. So they're required to run 2 Sunday ads. The next thing they're required to do is to actually follow up. People are going to respond to the ads, and the employer is going to have to interview anybody that is minimally qualified for the job and make sure as to whether or not they meet all the job requirements and duties, that they have experience in all of them that are required. The employer is not required to hire somebody by going through this advertising process, but it is a test of the labor market to see who's out there. Once the employer is done with the interviews, the next thing that we have to do is to make a file with the results that the employer is required to keep to show that, yes, indeed, I went through this process. Here are the people that have applied. Here's why we rejected these people, and here's why the immigrant is the only person that's qualified. Once they've put that in a file, they can then file online with the Department of Labor for certification. Currently, it takes anywhere from 6 months to a year, sometimes even longer, to get certification. And the reason the employer keeps the file is that sometimes the Department of Labor will ask the employer, hey, we want to make sure you went through this process, that you actually interviewed people, and we want to make sure that you rejected them for lawful reasons that relate to the minimum qualifications for the job. So that's step one of the whole immigration process, is to go through the Department of Labor. It's the hardest step. Again, more information about this is on my website. It's www.immigration-professor.com, or by calling our office at 310-384-0200. So after the employer is done with the Labor Department, let's assume that they've approved the case and they've certified the case. The next step is to file something called an I-140 with immigration. There's two things that the employer is required to show. One is that they have the ability to pay the immigrant. The employer is supposed to pay the immigrant what's called the prevailing wage for the job. So they have to show ability to pay. They have to show their tax returns, or if the immigrant's already working there, they can show that they're already paying the immigrant the prevailing wage. There's other ways, too, that they can show this that we can get into in any specific case. The second thing that they have to show is that the immigrant is qualified for the job. So if the job requires a certain number of years' experience, the employee has to get letters from past employers documenting that experience. If the job requires a degree, you have to show that the employee has that degree. So that's the I-140 process. The last and final step is the I-485. Now, one thing I want to emphasize is that there may be a significant time gap between the I-140 being approved by immigration and when you can file the I-485. That time gap is because there's only a certain amount of green cards a year, and before the employee can finalize and get a green card, in fact, they may have to wait until it's their turn. So I'll explain more about that in another video on a topic called priority dates. So for the last part of the process, the I-485, the employee has to show that they are not barred from immigrating. But that involves there's certain bars to immigrating for criminals. There's certain bars for people that have violated the immigration laws. There's certain medical bars for certain diseases. The employee is required to take a medical exam, for example, and make sure their vaccinations are up to date. Those are some of the requirements for everybody, in fact, that immigrates, whether it's based on this process or any other process. So, again, to summarize, and the time gap between the I-140 being approved and the 485 can be as much as 3 years, 4 years, even 7 or 8 years, depending upon the skill level of the job that's required in the country that the immigrant is from. That's something that's very hard for a lot of people to understand. Again, more information is available about all these topics on my website, www.immigration-professor.com, or by calling our office at 310-384-0200. And even though this is quite a long process and it's 3 steps, could take some years, the final result is a green card for the employee and their family, permanent residence. And once they're a permanent resident for 5 years, they can then apply to become a naturalized citizen. Thanks very much for watching our video today. And again, please catch us on the web at www.immigrationprofessor.com.